wonderful to be with you. I will read some of my stuff, uh, and then tomorrow and after tomorrow, some of my talks for you will be also connected. Some of this poetry. Um, I will be mostly reading from the book called Air Raid, which in Russian is "Воздушная тревога." Um, same basic meaning, though in Russian, also, if you think about this word long enough, it's not only the military term for bombing or shelling, but also some feeling of anxiety that permeates everything. I write in Russian only, poetry, but I'm lucky enough that for some time now American poets have been translating my stuff, and I will read some translations, prop us up. This time, this will be translations by a rather amazing Belarusian American poet, Valzhina Mort. So, a couple of more words of context and why I'm here with you, presenting to you yet another dimension of the problem, being different dimensions of the Soviet literature problem, бытование советской литературы. At some point, while Yasha was mostly centered on representations, literary representations of the Gulag, though then Yasha took it to various places. I've been working for the last 15 years on how the siege of Leningrad became literature and culture, and just that we're on the same page. The siege of Leningrad lasted from September 8th, 1941 to January 27th, 1944, and it was a rather unprecedented event for the 20th century, though there were more than enough precedents in history when a city would be taken in a ring, in a circle, uh, with the idea that it would give up, right, and open its gates for the attacking army. But this never happened in Leningrad, and for a little bit less than 900 days, the city was resisting the Nazi attack, which led to all kinds of results, including around 1 million of human lives, mostly to starvation, but also to bombing and shelling. My particular end of research and of project is connected to the fact that since they besieged the whole city, which at the beginning of the siege had like 3 million of its population, among them there were writers and artists and composers and so on. So I grew up there. I came to this country when I was 22, and I'm 47, which means that I grew up in first Leningrad and then Petersburg. And at the beginning of my life, it was Soviet Union and Leningrad, and I grew up at the southern, outskirtish, suburbanish area, which during the siege was very much next to the Nazi encirclement, actually, position. And if you arrive to Petersburg today, one of the first things that you see is a huge monument to героические защитники города. And this is how we grew up, endlessly listening to the stories about the stoic, heroic, and endlessly courageous and very, very active defenders of the city. We studied this at school. They would take us to the guided tours to this monument, for example. So this all was very much on our radar. And when I went to the city to meet some publishers when I was 30, already from Berkeley, where I was in graduate school, step by step, I began discovering that all this flow of information about the siege story is miraculously in some kind of alternative history, alternative universe, um, in a very strange relationship to the so-called reality. And this is how my archival research started. I interviewed, I read archives, uh, and I understood that how things were in real life. There was a extremely interesting, to put it mildly, disconnect with how it was presented in propaganda. And also, this is when my interest in propaganda, in Soviet propaganda, began. And for years, I've been saying that propaganda, again, Soviet propaganda, for example, this particular case, struck me as something incredibly sophisticated, as a very powerful institution where everybody who wanted to survive in the city and could write, could paint, and so on, everybody worked for it because it was the ticket for survival, the only ticket for survival. So when you study art and literature of Leningrad of that time, you see the Soviet version mostly, and it's incredibly interesting. But also things that I found um, were things that never were meant for publication. So the world that I found, again, it was this kind of two-dimensional world, very often created by the same people, which is extremely kind of almost, I don't know, uncanny that the same people would describe their disastrous experience for the Soviet propaganda, and as we call it, stol. In Russian, we say "vstol na stol," right? And also, at some point, maybe tomorrow, I will read you some of the works of the actual siege poets who never meant to publish their work. Maybe for starters, I will read a poem that was kind of a beginning of the whole thing. It comes from a cycle called the Directory of the Leningrad Writers, 1941-1944. There is a story to it. When I began my research in the archives, I understood at some point that I am kind of losing my mind because I'm reading and reading stuff written by people in 1941, 1942. And that winter, the so-called season of death, is when most of them died. So I'm reading this stuff, and many, many names I don't know. And again, I was in my 30s. I'm from that city. I thought of I've done my PhD on Leningrad culture at Berkeley. So I kind of assumed that I know something. And there was this kind of space gap of not knowing that pushed me So the poem that I'll read to you now, first in English and then in Russian, is about a woman poet called Olga Bergolz, the most famous of the siege poets. Most 99% of people who know anything about the siege culture know of her, but 100% of people who know anything about the siege culture know of the Seventh Symphony by Dmitry Shostakovich. Ta 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 ta. Shostakovich and Akhmatova, of whom I presume you've heard, were lifted from the city during the third week of September 1941. It was Stalin's idea to save his favorite, and this is another layer of complete, total strangeness and profoundly S&M situation that is Soviet power, that Stalin took really, really good care of his writers and composers. For example, he saved Akhmatova and Shostakovich. Akhmatova wrote about the siege, but not much. A couple of poems were published in Pravda newspaper, in the Pravda newspaper, but she also wrote about the siege a lot in the text called Поэма без героя, the poem without hero, which never was meant for the Soviet publication. And Shostakovich was lifted from the city, so to say, by airplane, specifically with the idea that he will write the cultural text. And this is for another moment, but I can tell you how the Seventh Symphony was performed, and it's an incredible story. The manuscript was flown from Kuybyshev, the city of Kuybyshev, where Shostakovich lived at the moment, to New York. And actually, one of the first performances of the Seventh Symphony happened in New York. And only then it was performed in Leningrad. So again, the world of various collaborations of these people with power is very strange. So Shostakovich is the main voice, so to say, but Olga Bergolz is the second best, if you wish. Since again, with poetry, we always have a problem that it needs to be translated, but also it cannot be translated. We have some form of paradox there. Bergolz is an incredibly interesting cultural figure. Her life, her creative career filled with all kinds of contradictions. She was the goddess of the Komsomol movement, of the young communist movement in the 1930s. And she was then arrested in 1938 and tortured, which you'll hear from the poem. Then she was let go, and that was a huge shock for her, I would say so, because she was extremely committed to the whole communist endeavor. And in September 1941, she was offered to accompany Akhmatova out of the city, and she said no, no, thank you. And as some of you know, the person who accompanied Akhmatova to Tashkent was Lydia Chukovskaya. And Akhmatova's life in Tashkent, Chukovskaya's life in Tashkent, since we've mentioned Tashkent earlier, is another incredibly interesting story. In general, what was happening in evacuation, including Tashkent and Alma-Ata, and how culture existed there, still needs more research. There are books and dissertations to be written about it, but we are in Leningrad. So Bergolz decides not to go for a number of reasons. One of them is that Bergolz and this is the first line of the poem, who was an incredibly beautiful creature and had one of my favorite phrases. Somebody once said this about Akhmatova. Akhmatova's best friend was asked in a late interview, could you please talk to us about Akhmatova's love life? And her friend, after a pause, said, well, you know, Anna had a rich life of heart, which I think is a brilliant euphemism because Akhmatova had endless affairs with creatures of both sexes and lots of biological species. Virgos did the same. So basically, she chose to stay in the city because she had an affair then and she was married. And also, one would think, though it's a difficult question, but as a result, if we judge from the result of that story, Bergold's really it was her moment of fame. I would say moment of immortality, which had a rather high price tag. Her husband died of starvation, and she broke. Later, she died in the psychiatric asylum of alcoholism. But that was later. What else is interesting? Again, again and again, and it is a huge story, part of the story that serious work most often for the likes of me and Yasha implies archival work. So not necessarily, but if you work on the 20th century, in most cases, this is very important. So I saw the archive of the radio committee, and I saw Bergolz's work, her manuscripts, and her machinopis. And what was absolutely amazing, and what was a great lesson for me at this time, and if, as I dreamt then, but now it's a joke, if it would be possible to have an institute dedicated to the siege culture, one of the directions of that research would be to study censorship. And in general, to understand Soviet culture means to understand the workings of censorship. So when I saw рукопись и машинопись выступлений Бергольц, what I saw and what absolutely amazed me, I saw comments by the censors, and in comparison to the other people who worked for the radio committee, and their censors usually wrote in black and red, for Bergolz they worked and wrote in green. She had literally зеленая дорожка, which was kind of astounding. In addition, this is important. One of my main sources of my particular work, I understand that Yasha worked a lot and maybe predominantly with the epistolary forms, with letters. I predominantly worked with the diaries, since the whole question of letters from the siege city into the siege city is very problematic. It's a different part of my research, of which I also can talk to you later, maybe tomorrow or day after tomorrow. So, stuck in the besieged dying city, city of death, with the light situation being more or less like this. There was no electricity on top of no everything else. They would spend, so again, it's autumn, it's winter in Leningrad. There is no light after 4 p.m. And all you can do, they will kind of lying in their rooms, trying to save up some energy since they all were disappearing from starvation, and they would write. So an astonishing result of the siege is that I guess thousands of diaries were produced of people like us, like you. Not that many of them survived, comparatively speaking, because of what happened after the siege. during the so-called Leningrad affair, the punitive affair, the wave of purges of 1946. Another extremely important date for Akhmatova, as you know, when the city was, putting it crudely, punished for its incredible behavior during the siege. Most of the diaries disappeared, and but not all of them. One of the diaries that unbelievably and weirdly survived is the diary of Olga Bergold, published now. We all have our favorite documents of the Soviet age, but when I'm asked, like, if there are three documents, if there are three books to read about the siege, I absolutely recommend that you read the diary of Olga Bergold, because then you'll understand that you kind of understand nothing, which I think is one of the most productive feelings in general, because the person who, again, has comments in green on her margins when she works on the radio, uh, since most of her poetry, which is great poetry, by the way, you can write great propaganda poetry. This is, again, something that is not that simple as a concept. Simultaneously, she writes a diary that reads as vehemently, passionately, flagrantly anti-Soviet. So there is this duality, and in both of her beings, dimensions, and political persona, she is extremely frank. She is extremely sincere. How can it be? What does it mean? What kind of um, political psyche is in action? This is something that we all are trying to contemplate. And two last things. So since I've been repeating this word, Radio Komitet, and another extremely important part of this study is something also that you work with Yasha a lot on, is the question of medium, the question of media. And I think your generation, which understands media so well, better than we do in a way, uh, thanks to all the developments, will do next step of research of how media worked for the Soviet age. For example, since there was severe shortage of materials, I mean paper, I mean ink, I mean human resources, the most important medium for the бесичный Leningrad was radio. Радио работало в каждом доме. Why? Because this was how the signals of the air raid were radio broadcasted. It was, people would be arrested for not having radio on. But other than having all the signals, граждане воздушная тревога, граждане воздушная тревога, there was very energetic programming, lots of music, of which you'll also hear some traces in my writing, lots of poetry, lots of театр у микрофона, something akin to what I'm doing now. Not that much news. There was not much they were able to say to the citizens, because for the first, let's say, 8 months of the siege, news were abominable. This Red Army was losing city after city after city. By the way, the case of Leningrad was unique, because most of the great cities of the Soviet Union were occupied. All of you know what happened to Kiev, and I suspect most of you have heard словосочетание Бабий Яр, right? Where tens of thousands were disappeared during 3 days in September of 1941. But the same happened to Minsk, the same happened to Odessa. Two cities that were not occupied were Moscow and Leningrad. And again, we're still very much in the process of studying these events historically. And last 2 years really activated this. Since Putin's propaganda works very much by refreshing pathologically events of that war. Putin's family, as everybody knows, is from Leningrad. Putin was born, allegedly, он был очень поздний ребенок, born because his elder brother died during the siege. So siege story is kind of poignantly present for his imagination, if we can pretend that we know anything about his imagination. So the first poem is about the case of Olga Bergolds. A couple of things that also might be of some importance is that her boyfriend, whom I've mentioned, was a very prominent scholar of the 18th Russian poetry and culture, and a couple of characters from that time will emerge for a moment. So I'll read in English, in Volgina's translation, and then in Russian, the original, and you'll understand, even from this experience, huge difficulty of what it means to translate poetry, what it means to work in translation, which also is a part of your problem with Tamizdat. And we can talk about it more. We can talk about any of this more tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So this is called Olga Bergolds' voice. Голос. Angel. Not blau. Angel. Like Dietrich. But Russia red. Young communist Lily Marlene, with lower lip girlishly bit, and unprecedented clarity of her cheekbones. Girl, good luck to you. In fact, tough luck to you. NKVD man knocks a chair from under you, a slope of grease. NKVD man, a boy from secret police, knocks a child out of you. But this doesn't stop your enthusiastic thrash. Diary. What does your diary say? January 15th, fog of grease, fog of bitter ice. You leave a young unwanted husband in the hospital to die, and breathing heavily, you drag yourself to the radio bureau. Walking by the corpses in amber, by the corpses in turquoise. What artist, you wonder, colored them? He was good. Your new guy questions where you've been. What would Barkov say about this? What would Zubov say about this? Beautiful gentleman surrounding Catherine the Great. What's wrong with you, anyway? And most importantly, what is it that you're wearing? Your stinger of ice hardens. You drill a kiss into him. You bury yourself into a microphone. You suppress doubts. The most important thing now is to suppress doubts. Not to doubt the following. Didn't you run here in one breath, while there he, another he, was breathing his last? No, no, you didn't. Your high-pitched voice penetrates where no other thing, where no other nothing. Sisters, brothers of mine, you say. Sisters, brothers of mine, you squeak. Mothers, daughters of mine, I worship you, I watch you, I chirp, as I fall, as I fall, as I fuss. What's that on you, anyway? It's my husband's coat. Your husband's coat? Well, what have you got under the coat, my friend? Ангел, но не голубой, алый, алый. Комсомолка Лили Марлен с пуритански закушенной нижней губой, с небывалой плотской ясностью скул. Во всем тебе удача. Только разве вот незадача? НКВДшник выбивает из-под тебя стул. Жирная лужа. НКВДшник выбивает из тебя дитя. Ну и от этого тремоло энтузиазма практически не убывает. 15 января, говорит твой дневник. 15 января, жирный ледяной туман, стужа, ты оставляешь в больнице юного нежеланного мужа умирать. И запыхаясь, пыхтя, тащишься на улицу Ракова, мимо янтарных трупов и бирюзовых трупов. Ах, какой художник все это рисовал! Твой новейший миллионочек допрашает. Где ты была? Где ты сегодня была? Чтобы об этом сказал поэт Барков? Чтобы на это ответил красавчик Зубов? Ну что ты такая? Смотри на меня. Что ты такая? Что это, дорогая, за искусительный, за унизительный карнавал? Выпуская ледяное яркое жало, ты лобызаешь его, ты погружаешься в микрофон, отстраняя сомнения. Не слишком ли быстро сюда бежала, покуда там покуда там до ходил он? Нормально, не слишком быстро. Твой высоконький голос проникает туда, куда другое ничто. Сестры, братья мои, дочки матери, я восхищаюсь вами, насыщаюсь вами, утешаюсь вами, падая, 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 беспокоясь. Что это на тебе? Пальто Молчанова. А что у нас под пальто? Okay. So, next two poems are kind of made in the same method, if you wish, but characters are different. One of them is one of the chiefs of the Leningrad official literature during the siege, Всеволод Вишневский. And it's, again, since I just opened Yasha's book, for which we were waiting for so long time, and kind of in the introduction it says, let's think about Tamizdat as an institution, right? When we think literature, we were trained to think about literature as an institution. Think of, mm, uh, and again, the city is under the siege, as you heard in the poem, which also kind of my whole project, as described by now, one of its problems, what is its relationship to the document? Can a poem be a document? Uh, what if the writer works with documents? What is the extremely gestural problematic relationship? But also, Yasha recommended to you that you watch a documentary by Sergei Loznitsa, 900 Days. So what Loznitsa did, he traveled to Leningrad, Petersburg, he visited several film studios where in the boxes they have reels, things shot in Leningrad which never were meant, never made it to the official movies about the siege. Actually, there was mostly one film called Leningrad and the Battle. Mm. And the script for this film was written by Всеволод Vishnevsky, who was as Soviet, as successful, as I don't know what else, as possible. But Vishnevsky decided to write about the siege, to write the script according to the idea of the Soviet tragedy, sublime. And eventually he was prohibited to do that. His script never became a movie, which became a huge drama for him. And since we have diaries of Vishnevsky, we can read all that. So Vishnevsky is in the city. He is in constant conversation with the party headquarters and Andrei Zhdanov, the name you should know, an incredibly interesting figure like Richelieu, uh, for example, for a certain moment of French history, like some of us think like Goebbels for the Nazi Germany, Andrei Zhdanov, who was the leader of party for during the siege, and then pioneered the campaign of 1946 against Akhmatova. And by the way, since you study Akhmatova and the campaign of 1946, when she was declared to be the, I don't know what, she was declared to be the wrong poet, the wrong voice. And also, you know, if you read Foucault and all this stuff on biopower and Agamben, sometimes one thinks that when you study this material, it's very, very real, because they would punish people by taking their food away. Akhmatov was denied food rations in 1946 in Leningrad after the siege. So according to this policy, she was supposed to die. But very, very brave people, because to bring her soup could be very well the reason for an arrest. But people like Bergold, by the way, would bring her some kind of food arrangements. What is interesting for me about this story is that Bergold was the ideal candidate for the punitive campaign of 1946. And we don't know why they preferred Akhmatova. Bergolz was sure that she would be arrested then. And this is when she buried her diary. And there is this whole story, which we researched, that she would bury her diary and then think, fuck, my diary would disappear. and then she would ask her then husband. Um, she married her lover of the previous poem to unearth the diary. So the diary was constantly having some kind of adventures of going up and down, up and down. And sometimes I think it would be cute to describe the whole story from the point of view of the poor diary. So Всеволод Вишневский, who has a task to look after poets and writers remaining in the city. And these poets and writers, most of them really were interested in meeting these people of power because, again, these people had power to give them some food. And though before the siege and at the end of the 1930s, which produced Requiem, uh, most of the most important writers of Leningrad who resisted the Soviet thing were murdered. Um, these people who attempted to resist the Soviet thing, they really tried not to collaborate with the Soviets. But when hunger comes, no, there is a great Russian proverb, "Голод не тетка." So they would talk to people like Vishnevsky and work with them, so on. Open their doors for Vishnevsky. So the next two poems are about Vishnevsky visiting two old ladies. And by old, as many people told me, and punishment comes. So one of them is 51. And since I'm 47, I'm beginning to rethink the whole thing. Maybe not that old. But this is another thing when you work with the siege, this endless descriptions of life of the body and what dystrophy, the hunger disease, does to you. Not only you lose your age, but basically you lose your sex after not eating for 4 months. So Vishnevsky comes and visits two ladies. One of them is Olga Matyushina. Another of them is Natalia Krandievskaya. Now they are published. I was lucky and privileged to publish them. Krandievskaya is like a big poet, I think. I claim that she's a remarkable poet. Matyushina wrote a very interesting book, prose book. She walked into the shelling situation in October and she lost her vision. So she wrote a book about the siege from the point of view of, of the blind person. And I wrote a big article at some point about the siege darkness and what it did to the urban sensibility. Давайте я почитаю. Yes. Again, first English to help us, and then Russian. The first poem is called Hearing, слух. A faithful, a cheekful, a helpful prince enters a blind woman's room. Announce yourself, she orders, and preferably announce yourself with a song. So he bursts into a song of life, a song of the Kremlin, a song of young Marines in the Baltic sable of beavers, of his moist land sweetened with the siege lice. The blind woman sighs with delight, moves her ears in gratitude like a tender horse, and predicts, "You are the one. You are the one, my prince, for you will compose for us Blockade, the musical." "Did I hear you right?" he asks. Darling, you heard me right. A musical with bare dances, catchphrases, and punchlines, with a male lead in tights stretched over his private wonders. A schoolboy shaking in ecstasy as a red scarf squeezes his neck. It will be as fictional as our reality and in compliance with the demons of this genre. Well, my blind comrade, I'm ready. Now you tell me. Let me interview you. Tell me of the things you've heard this winter. What have you heard? I've heard rustle, rustle, whiff, as I fell asleep into death. I heard the gentle, inedible dab of rats. I heard the sharp, delicious stench of paint, while all these great artists of the Silver Age came to me as ghosts. Blue, that smelled like Mikhail Vasilievich, my husband. Violet, that smells like Elena Gennadievna, the wife of my husband. Guro, Guro, Elena Guro, with the face of sheep, came by. I heard her triumphant pit-a-pat. So how did that city sound? The city buzzed, gnashed, murmured, tickled. A children's skating rink. I bolted ice skates to the dresses where my insane booby baby lay, my only siege friend. And then I wheeled her along the main avenue, Prospect, Prospect, and left her there. From the radio speaker, honey-like, silk-like, fish oil-like arias from the Viennese operetta streamed. That famous aria, "Помнишь ли ты?" Do you recall? Do I recall? Do you recall? That was a dream. What a dream that was. Слух. Мордастый, щекастый, румяный царевич входит к слепой. Молви, она ему говорит, кто ты такой? А еще лучше пропой. И он начинает песню о жизни, о Кремле, о морячках балтийских саблебровых, о земле, пропитанной, подслащенной блокадными вшами. Слепая вздыхает блаженно, как конь благодарно придает ушами, предрекает: от тебя будет толк, ибо ты нам напишешь блокадную оперетту. Он говорит: извините, ослышался. Она говорит: именно, именно, Мася моя, с танцами, плясками, с шутками-прибаутками, с героем-любовником в синем трико, обтягивающим чудеса, травести в пионерском галстуке, от экстаза дрожащим. Там все будет как настоящее, как в настоящем, но только в жанровой переработке. Он говорит: чудеса. Я готов слушаться тебя, слепая. Расскажи ко мне, что ты слышала той зимой. Я слышала шорохи, 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 запахи. Засыпая в смерть, я слышала деликатное, несъедобное прикосновение крыс. Я слышала краски, острую вонь. Голубая пахнет, как Михаил Васильевич, синяя пахнет, как Елена Генриховна. Тень Гуро, насмешница с овечьим лицом, приходила сюда. Я слышала ее торжествующий топоток. Город звенел, скрежетал, шептал, щекотал, как каток на Елагином острове в детстве. К шкафу прикручивались коньки. В шкафу лежала моя безумица, любимица, Муленька. Я катала, 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 катила ее по Большому проспекту. Там и оставила. Из радиоточки, как мед, как шелк, как рыбий жир, на нас текли арии венской оперетты, арии Сильвы. Помнишь ли ты? Помню ли я? Помнишь ли ты? Пусть это был только сон, но какой. So, being pleasantly impressed by his conversation with that old lady, Vishnevsky continues his tour and enters an apartment of the next one. And that conversation allegedly goes like this. It's called monument, памятник. A face man, a health man, a brow man, a prince, enters the room of a miser. Why are you here? Why do you laze here? Why aren't you on the run from this city? Your sons have sent for you to beat off bad dreams. Leningradchiks suck on the breasts of our big land. Where should I go? All my goods are here. All my books are here. All my frocks are here. All my creeks are here. All my kids are here. My 2 rats are here. Paul and Paul, transfixed on the shelf. Dad glances at collected Chekhov works, at dry correspondence, bitter satirical shorts, such coddled high-maintenance pets, my 2 rats. Never ever would I trade this daybreak dark and this twilight dark, the ba, the moo of the blockade crazies, the see-through bruit de silence before the blast, and later the dust and smoke, the dust and smoke over the skeleton of my ex-house, in my ex-corner, where I read to you on the old rug. Do you recall the smile of happiness. Do you recall the smile of happiness? It's still here, since I cannot close my scurvy gums. Paul and Peter, two rats, are restless in their trance. I should get up and tug them, since they're like my two sons to me. How tickled I am by this spider's nest. Silly prince, go away, for we live humbly. Silly prince, we waste not a crumb of our past. Time rolls slowly, like a triumphant tank, like a beautiful Soviet tank. It rolls, then back, like a hole in the dark, like a mountain of burning leaves, from Tavrichesky garden to Mikhailovsky garden, while dystrophics shit, while children of the siege shoot. Памятник. Мордастый, бровастый, румяный царевич входит к скупой. На кой ты здесь лежишь? Почему не бежишь? За тобой присылали твои сыновья. Крутогруда, обильно большая земля. Из сосков ее пить ленинградцы должны. И позабыть нехорошие сны. И куда мне бежать? Здесь все вещи мои. Но куда мне бежать? Здесь все книги мои. Здесь все платья мои. Здесь все реки мои. Здесь все дети мои. Здесь две крысы мои. Поль и Франц притаились на полке, сидят. На собрание Чехова томно глядят. Переписка суха, фельетоны горьки. Побрезгливей Суворина эти зверьки. Никому не отдам, не возьму ни вечернюю тьму, ни рассветную тьму, ни безумцев блокадных ГГ и Муму, ни прозрачную брю де силанс, тишину перед взрывом и после, в пыли и в дыму, остов бывшего дома на бывшем углу, где читала тебя и тебе на полу. Помнишь ли ты, как улыбалось нам счастье? Помнишь ли ты? Помню ли я? Так оно и сейчас улыбается мне, и цинготные десны ему не закрыть. Поль и Франц копошатся тревожно во сне. Надо встать потеплее, малюток укрыть, как привольно в паучьем местечке моем. Неразумный царевич, мы кротко живем. И ни крохи былого не тратится здесь. Время вяло, торжественно катится здесь. То вперед, то назад, то вперед, то назад, словно мяч по дорожке, и листья чудят. То в Таврический сад, то в Михайловский сад, то дистрофики гадят, то дети галдят. Okay, so let's see. What else can we do? So, since this is this kind of stuff, and it's all absolutely unbearable, though again we are so confused by this point about the affect part of this, and every person who works with this kind of material has his or her own way to deal with these characters and with the stories to protect oneself. Uh, I always repeat that for me, the siege research was on some level extremely joyful one, though also constantly unbearably painful, since I've met all these incredible characters and their stories and their documents, all these poets and artists. But at some point, when the publisher of this book, Matvey Yankelevich, said to understand that like it's a book of darkness only, can we do anything about it? So I decided to write a poem called Joy, Радость, which I think, since I'm in this perverse position of being a poet and a scholar, when I attempt to read this poem as a scholar, which is a sign of schizophrenia, I think it's a poem about archive. It's a poem about a tiny moment among thousands of moments of sadness and frustration of the archival research when actually something does come to light and you suddenly can see it and show it off. Joy. An earring returns from under the cupboard, a bewept, priceless, pennyworth Venetian chip, twinkling with guilt through the dust, or possibly fur. Say Polina Annenkova-Gebel, cast into the murk of snows, of the snows of Siberian exile. What is it? Is it moss or musings of a life past due? Okay, what will you do now? What will we do now together? We've grown used to your absence on earth, wailed and listed you among losses. It's a long list. An ice chip of the Siberian exile of the 1826. You, a goofball, you will lay now in the heat of my palm, then in a cozy box next to your pair, your little sis. She, it, she, also scratched in the transit of time, by plain yearning, by yearning for a pair. Now, now you can be carried into the light, into the light, into the light. Now you can be carried in my ear, and you will whisper into my ear. How bright and nice, how bright and nice and plain, and all of it so good. Радость. Вот возвращается из-под шкафа давно оплаканная, бесценнейшая копеечная серьга. Венецийское стеклышко, виновато поблескивая сквозь пыль как будто сквозь смех. Кто ты? Допустим, Полина Анненкова, упавшая в тень, в снега, просроченной жизни, сквозь смех. Кем ты будешь теперь? Здесь уже все привыкли, что нет тебя на земле. Поплакали да зачислили в сытный список потерь. Читинская льдинка, дурочка. Будешь лежать в тепле моей ладони, потом в уютной коробочке со своей парою, своей младшей сестрой, тоже несколько поцарапанной в ходе времени, тоскою просто и по тебе тоской. Теперь вас можно вынести в свет, чтобы каждая шептала мне на ушко: мне здесь светло и радостно, мне здесь светло и радостно, мне просто, мне хорошо. And one more last poem, since my battle with the mosquitoes is not a successful one. I will find it. Mhm. Mhm. Mm-mm. 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 Неполное удобство. Финиш компьютера. Мгм. Мгм. Вот. So the last one is called встреча, encounter. And you will understand what it is, how it's done. It's also a result of reading, as most of the poems that I do, not all, but many. Uh, and this is made of the book, which is, I guess, my absolutely favorite book about not the siege, but the Soviet segment of the Second World War, which for propaganda purposes was forever called the Great Patriotic Soviet War, Великая Отечественная. Now, we don't call it this way. It's a very long story. Why? So it's a memoir of a guy called Николай Никулин, воспоминания. Николай Никулин, and I'm in the process of writing an essay about this book now, kind of complicated when you're in the midst of something. He was 16 when he started his siege story. He basically managed to get out of the besieged city, and that's how he was saved. And he ended up his war in Berlin, from Leningrad to Berlin. And after he survived, and he writes endlessly in this book that he never could understand why. As for example, with Shalamov, we never understand why. So romantically, we think that these people survived in order to write their books, describe their experience, but this is a romantic reading. Also, there is a cute detail that he was absolutely professionally brilliant, and he became the curator of the Dutch department of the Dutch oil painting of the Hermitage, which is the second after Amsterdam collection of the Dutch painting of the 16th, 17th century in the world. So the book is called "Воспоминания." It's воспоминания about the atrocities of the war from the point of view of somebody who then was 16 and then became a brilliant art historian. And in 1975, he wrote this book. But you'll understand that this is kind of very contextual to the text of this poem. Encounter with the epigraph from Nikolai Nikulin, I was a worthless soldier. She didn't know her father. She didn't know her father well. She was 2 when he got killed in action. No notice followed. A small photograph remained, a face full of light, stark resemblance. Though the photograph faded over time, 77 years after his death, she met a book, a strange book, that refused not to remember, refused not to see what pot has been stirred, какую заварили кашу. I guess the author of this book was strange. For one, he was 16. He was 16, he was beautiful, he was difficult, he was unpleasant. And he didn't die. He didn't die at a rural rail station called Pogostye. What a name for a rail station. Piles of corpses by the railroad station looked like snowed over hills, and only the bodies on top were distinguishable. In spring, once the snow melted, the lower bodies emerged, dressed in summer uniforms, soldiers' shirts and boots. On top of them lay Marines in heavy leather jackets and black flared trousers. On top of the Marines, in short fur jackets and wool boots, lay the Siberians, who launched attacks in January-February of 1942. She read this in her forever impeccably beautiful voice, actually too beautiful for this purpose. She bookmarked this spot with a yellow scrap of paper. She said she wanted to discuss this with me. She asked, couldn't it be him? Because couldn't he? Right there. Because couldn't he lie just like that? What do you think? Look here, for example. Her finger crashed into the letters. She read, we step over the corpses, we run over the corpses, we hide under the corpses, as if it were a common thing, as if it were a common thing. And in that moment, speaking, crying, speaking and crying, disgusted and happy with her encounter. How beautiful she was, how young. Солдат я был никудышный, читая Николая Никулина. Она не знала своего отца, она плохо знала своего отца. Когда он погиб, ей было 2 года, никакая весть не достигла. Осталась маленькая фотография. Очень светлое лицо, разительное сходство. Впрочем, фотография выцвела. 77 лет спустя, после его гибели, она повстречала книгу, трудную книгу, вздорную, не желающую подчиняться, не желающую не помнить, какую заварили кашу. Вздорным был ее автор, 17-летний неженка, колючка, почему-то не погибший в населенном пункте с подходящим названием Погостье. Табеля трупов в железной дороге выглядели тогда, как заснеженные холмы, и были видны лишь тела, лежащие сверху. Но позже весной, когда снег стаял, открылось и все, что было внизу. У самой земли лежали убитые в летнем обмундировании, в гимнастерках, в ботинках. Это были жертвы осенних боев 1941 года. На них рядами громоздились морские пехотинцы в булатах и широких черных брюках клише, черных брюках, клешах. А выше — сибиряки в полушубках и валенках, пригнанные сюда, под Ленинград, умирать, сибиряки, шедшие в атаку в январе-феврале 42-го. Вот это место она заложила маленькой желтой закладкой. Решила все же со мной поговорить. Просила все же. Ведь это мог быть он. Ведь это мог быть и он там. Ведь это и он там мог лежать так. Как ты думаешь? Вот тут написано. Ее идеальный ноготь воткнулся в страницу. Вот тут написано. Идем по трупам, перебегаем по трупам, прячемся под трупами. Как будто так и надо. Как будто так и надо. В тот момент, когда она это говорила и плакала, плакала и говорила от отвращения и радости, радости, радости встречи. О, какая она была молодая и какая красивая. Thank you. So that's it for now. Let's breathe and smoke and breathe. And tomorrow we'll discuss. Right. Yep. Спасибо вам огромное.